You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And I'm Martin Robbins.
This week, do the Tories have a point about net zero? But first, some classic nonsense from Natural England.
So, James, I have some disturbing news, which is that Natural England apparently seem to have taken control of West Sussex.
What, literally, Martin? Like, is this an escalation? Are they like an invading army occupying West Sussex now?
Yes, James, the enemy has been hiding in his strongholds on the South Downs, building up his grand army, and now he's sweeping across the commuter belts. The great towns of Midhurst and Petworth have fallen, the whole of Billingshurst is in his hands, and we must expect another blow to be struck, almost immediately, at Crawley or sorry, I got carried away there, James, but it's pretty serious stuff.
I just want to remind listeners, you aren't imagining things. Winston Churchill is not in the room with us. It sounds exactly like it, but like...
Friend of the pod.
Yeah, friend of the pod, Winston Churchill. So, Martin, what's going on? What do Natural England actually want?
Well, James, they want water for their snails. And whereas Vladimir Putin uses tanks and drones and artillery and, thousands of Russian troops to achieve his objectives, Natural England have a much more cunning and sophisticated weapon, which apparently is strongly worded lettuce.
Okay, Martin, you're going to have to explain this to me. So what's going on and why aren't we sending in like the RAF to try and stop them?
So this story comes from Michael Dinez, who is a good friend of the pod. He was on a recent episode, and he's got one of those jobs in kind of policy and think tanks, which I can't explain no matter how many times I ask him about it. And roughly once a month, he will post something like a thread on Twitter that will absolutely break your brain. And his most recent post is about a letter that he uncovered, which Natural England sent to Horsham District Council. And it's one of the most extraordinary 2-page letters that I think I've ever seen in terms of just grabbing power.
So Natural England, they're a quango. We've talked about them far too much on this podcast. They're like our regular villain every week. They're the Joker to our Batman. They were involved in the infamous Bat Tunnel. Again, they're the Joker to our Batman, I guess. They've blocked improvements to various roads. They even tried to block their own headquarters from being built. They're basically NIMBY ultras, yet inexplicably a literal part of the government. They're like not just a charity or something. They are part of the government who have to be consulted on nature stuff.
Yeah, essentially a sort of a civil war division of the government that fights the rest of the government. And they don't actually carry weapons unless you class a bat detector as a weapon. But in every other way, they're sort of like a revolutionary brigade of bureaucrats shutting down development on a massive scale across the UK and adding billions of pounds worth of costs to major projects. They're a public body. They're independent of the government, but in theory, they're subject to guidance from the minister in charge of DEFRA. And they were set up in 2006 to bring the powers of various earlier precursor organizations together in one place to protect the environment in a joined-up way. And this means, for example, they can define habitats and species that need protection, they can mark out areas of special scientific interest, and they can effectively set rules for any development that's going to impact those natural areas.
So that all sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Like, I think we want to protect the environment. It's good that we protect the environment and think about it in this sort of joined-up way.
Yeah, exactly. It is a completely reasonable goal, and it's sort of quite sensible in the same way that creating an AI to run your military defenses is also completely reasonable and sensible. But then somehow you end up with Skynet, and the next thing you know, Robert Patrick's trying to stab you in a steel factory. And malevolent AI is actually a really good analogy for Natural England because essentially the same kind of thing has happened. We've created this intelligent entity with sort of narrowly defined goals that it pursues with almost a religious zealotry, even when it causes considerable harm to people.
So we've got an alignment problem.
Literally.
So I'm curious how this has happened so quickly. So they've taken over West Sussex now. Were they this bad from the start, or did it take time for Natural England to sort of get like this with their iron fist?
So it was almost immediate. So a couple of years ago, a man called Peter Boggis died at the age of 91 at a small hamlet called Easton Bavance in Suffolk, which is one of those lovely names for English places, which I assume meant something at one point. But it's this tiny, tiny collection of houses a few miles north of Sizewell, actually, which is, another place well known to the pod. And this place has been slowly eaten away by coastal erosion over the years. So you end up with the little collection of houses which are perched on top of some cliffs. And the cliffs are absolutely famous for fossil hunting. Basically, as the sea's coming in and eroding them, all these fossils are just kind of falling down from the cliff face, and collectors go there and pick them off the beach, and everyone has a great time. So in 2006, around the time they were created, Natural England declared this beach in this area a Site of Special Scientific Interest, an SSSI. Now, meanwhile, Boggis wants to stop his home and the homes of his neighbours from falling into the sea, because this cliff is slowly working its way backwards across the land. And he's lived there since the 1930s, so he's been a resident there for 70 years. And whereas most people, obviously, if your house is about to fall into the sea, it's a bad day and there's probably not much you can do about it. Maybe send out a tweet or something. It turns out he's a retired agricultural engineer, which is like the perfect ex-career to deal with this problem. So he brings in 250,000 tons of clay soil and basically builds his own sea defenses to protect his community, like, as you do. It sort of sounds like a really extreme thing, but actually, if you look at pictures of it, it doesn't look like a horrendous pile of dirt. It sort of blends in with the beach and the landscape, and effectively, he becomes regarded as this kind of modern-day King Canute, holding back the waves and protecting the coastline of England. He's like a local hero.
I was going to say, this sounds like quite an inspirational story, Martin. So Natural England, they heard this, and I'm guessing they were pleased because he was there protecting the coastline and protecting all of those fossils from the sea.
So you would think so, but actually they sued him.
Oh.
And basically what they said was that the erosion of the cliffs is somehow scientifically important because of all of these fossils. And they basically said that he was interfering with the natural process of Britain's coastline eroding. And so they took him to court. Now, luckily, he fought them and he won in a famous judgment. And the judge basically said, look, you can't just declare something a site of special scientific interest and then just say, hey, if you're a resident there and you need to fix your home, you can't anymore. And if you need to stop your house falling into the sea, tough luck. So he lost the case.
So Natural England, they're famous for trying to protect, jumping spiders and declaring SSSIs do that. But now they're trying to protect animals that aren't even alive?
Yeah, it's the sort of natural extension, I guess, if you've run out of animals to complain about. Let's start with extinct animals and see if we can protect their actual fossils. And to be clear, I'm not even sure how their mandate extended to fossils in the first place. It's incredibly vague. But essentially, they're coming to the position that fossils are more important than people or people's homes falling into the sea. And that's the tone, this kind of Skynet vibe that's continued through to this day.
So that's Natural England, Martin. So what does this have to do with West Sussex? Because, like you said, they're under occupation.
Yeah, so I mean, the good news is that West Sussex is not about to fall into the English Channel, but I'd encourage people to read Michael Dinez's Substack. He goes into it in much more detail than we will here, and we'll post a link in the show notes at abundancepod.com where you can also subscribe. But essentially, Natural England want to protect a population of ram's horn snails in the Arun Valley in Sussex. Now, these are a rare, tiny, tiny snail. They're in various sites across the UK. They're also famous because a road in Norfolk has had improvements to it blocked for over a decade because of studies on the same species of snail happening in the area. And now the Arun Valley, it's a beautiful English kind of quintessential countryside river valley. It's a special conservation area. There's no chance of anyone building there, which is absolutely fine. Like, nobody would quibble with that valley being protected or the snails there being protected. It's a spectacular wildlife habitat. Great that it's being looked after. However, the valley is a river valley. And do you know what's important for rivers, James?
I'm guessing water, Martin.
Exactly. If you don't have water, you no longer have a river. So you need to make sure that the water doesn't dry out. Now, Natural England basically came to the position that the entire area that drains into this river and this valley is important for the preservation of that river in the future. And so even though they're not necessarily sure what the impact of things in that area would be, they want to make sure that there's no change at all, because if there is a change, it might affect the viability of the river and therefore the snails in the future. Now, this drainage area, is basically the entire northern half of West Sussex. It goes all the way from like Petersfield on the A3, just north of Portsmouth, right the way across to Gatwick Airport and Crawley and the border with Surrey and East Sussex and Kent. It's called the Sussex North Water Supply Zone, which is a catchy name, and it covers an area of roughly 350 square miles. Now, there are something like 3 or 4 councils in that area, and in 2021, Natural England sent an extraordinary letter to them, which said, by the way, you can't develop on this land if it leads to so much as a thimbleful of extra water being used by these developments.
Martin, this is breaking my brain. This is insane. I didn't realize this weird little government organisation was so madly powerful. I mean, it's taking me back to like geography lessons at school and drawing, maps of Oxbow lakes and watersheds and trying to colour them in. But 350 miles, and they said no of this whole area that you can't build on because of this one thing.
Exactly. And of course, like, how do you even build a house that doesn't use water? So it's almost like a veto on development. Now, Natural England would argue that they've set out some suggestions. So they say basically, well, every new build should have things like rainwater harvesting and grey water reuse to keep water usage as low as possible, like use as much from the rain as you can, recycle as much as you can. Now, straight away, that's adding a massive amount to the cost of a new house. So you're talking maybe several thousands of pounds worth of additional features and technology that you've got to build into the house. But even after you've installed all of that, the house is still going to need a water supply. It's still going to need fresh drinking water and so on. So developers or councils would then have to offset that by retrofitting existing commercial premises or houses with the same technology for even more thousands of pounds.
So if you wanted to build, say, 20,000 houses, you'd have to find another 20,000 homes to retrofit to try and balance out the water use?
Well, it's even worse than that, because ultimately you would probably need to retrofit lots of houses for each house that needs to now have like net zero water usage. So potentially, you're talking several thousands of pounds per house, tens of thousands of houses. This is like hundreds of millions of pounds of added cost for one large development, plus all of the logistics, the time, the planning. Like, where do you even find all of the people to build these water recycling systems? Where do you get the labor from? Is the supply chain even big enough to do this? But the best part of all of this, James, is this is not like fixed policy that Natural England were providing. They're just interim suggestions. And basically, the letter goes on to say, hey, we're working on a larger strategy for like water management in the area. So our suggestion is that actually the best thing to do is just to stop making decisions on any planning applications whatsoever until we've done that strategy work at, sometime in the future, I guess.
Oh my God, this reminds me of, this is a weird analogy, but you know how like a lot of left-wing people will go, well, to solve whatever problem is, first we must dismantle capitalism. It's a bit like that, yeah. But like the Shire Tory version of that. Before we can build a single house, we've got to do all this basically insane stuff.
Yeah, exactly. To all intents and purposes, it's basically an attempt to ban any kind of development in the entire region that's been issued by basically just a single letter from some random bureaucrat. And what we're seeing here with water, and what Michael Denez found here, it turns out, when I looked into this a bit further, it's not an isolated incident. It's actually part of a much wider trend across the country. So Simon Ricketts, who's a planning lawyer and blogger, he has a fantastic blog up, I think it's called Simonicity, which we can add a link to as well in the show notes. He's described these things as development embargoes. And now Natural England and others will insist that this isn't the case. It's not really an embargo. It's not technically a ban, but it has effectively the same consequence, which is just to ban new development in an entire region. Now, in the case of Sussex, the case that Michael found, this example is about water levels and the drainage into that river. But vast areas of Hampshire, Cornwall, Dorset, other countries along the south coast and up in the north as well, have seen these embargoes put in place around nutrients. So essentially, wherever additional houses or changes to agricultural usage might cause more runoff or more sewage that could ultimately impact rivers, Natural England has written to those authorities and said, again, you just need to stop all development in these areas kind of until we say so. And to give you some context of the scale of this, in 2022, so the year after the letter that Michael spotted, something like 74 planning authorities were placed under these embargoes, the entire length and breadth of Britain. Probably talking about, I would guess, like 10 to 15% of the entire country.
Yeah, I was going to say, where the hell can we actually build stuff if all of this stuff is taken seriously? Where's left? Is there like a car park in Kettering or something, which I don't understand? Where the hell?
But even then you couldn't, because nobody drinks water from a car park, and if there's any change in the water usage. So yeah, even if you had like a multi-story car park and you said we want to tear it down and build a park, like that would be banned because a park would use more water and cause more runoff if it had toilets in it or something. So it's an insane, like, sweeping kind of dictation that they've made here. And, essentially that has obviously tanked house building in these areas. Not only can developers not build the houses, they don't even have a timeline for when any planning decision could even happen. Now, the reason this has come up in the news recently is because Rachel Reeves had apparently been in talks with a developer in West Sussex who was trying to do exactly what we've just talked about. They wanted to build 20,000 new homes there, which is obviously in keeping with the policy of the government that we've just elected. And they basically went to Rachel Reeves and talked about this, and she has essentially come down and overruled the embargo, which of course is what the last Tory government could have done if they weren't, all fighting each other the whole time.
It's a bit like the Steve Reed situation with the Cambridge sewage works, because there was sort of a bureaucratic process that led to this bad outcome. And then, politicians just need to learn, oh no, you can actually overrule stuff. You can make political decisions. you can take a political risk because you're a politician and didn't decide to actually do stuff for the greater good, I guess. But anyway, Martin, so how did Natural England have the power to do this in the first place, just to unilaterally stop development in an entire region like this? This seems a bit crazy to me.
Yeah, I mean, that is the question. And it's, I think, a little bit of an open question. Like, do they actually have the power to do this? Or are they just making threats and throwing their weight around? And that works until someone bigger and badder comes in and puts a stop to it. Now, somewhat ironically, in the letter, they actually reference European case law as justification for what they're doing. Now, some of our sharper listeners, James, will know that we left the European Union back in 2016, but essentially a lot of this stuff was kind of waved through as part of that mad scramble to align Britain's regulatory policy and replace all of the EU-dependent legislation that was removed and make sure our laws still make sense. And so we've ended up kind of stuck with it. And I do, I'm not a big party political person, as you know, James, but I do find it slightly hilarious that you've got the sort of arch Remainer scourge of the right, Rachel Reeves, who's tearing up the European red tape and saying, get on with it. If I wanted to troll essentially everybody listening to the podcast, I'd say it's quite a Thatcherite move, James, but you can decide if you think that's a good thing or not.
I was going to say, Martin, you know that I would be the last Remainer in the jungle fighting the war long after it's long become irrelevant. But it does sound like, have we just found a benefit of Brexit?
I mean, but perhaps so, James. We'll put it on the big list that we're keeping. But I think it's a case that is worth highlighting, even though it's kind of resolved now, at least in this instance, because it's just such an extraordinary example of, this organization, this bureaucracy that was set up with incredibly noble aims. Like, we want to protect the environment, but it's turned into this kind of mad anti-democratic monster that's just sort of ordering local councils around, declaring that it has complete control over vast swathes of British territory. It's honestly the kind of behavior you'd expect from the heyday of the East India Company or something, right? Like bureaucrats in helmets strutting around and pointing at bits of hillside and like making sweeping declarations about who's allowed to be there and what you can do. And how is it possible that one tiny, tiny public body can just effectively ban construction across vast areas of the country, and there's just no scrutiny to it? There's no parliamentary oversight. It's just, well, I woke up this morning and I sent a letter and now that's banned for Sussex. Like, how do they have that power?
Martin, I love that you're talking up like this invading force, because I've no idea what the Natural England office is like, but I bet it's sort of a fairly dowdy normal government office with peeling wallpaper and, coffee cups piled up in the sink and so on. But yeah, it does seem weirdly powerful. But Martin, are we absolutely sure? Because you've railed against Natural England for the past however many minutes, and every week you're slagging them off. Are we sure you don't just hate the environment?
No. Like, I love driving my sports car through the environment on a regular basis. and like, as with so many of these topics, none of this, I think, is about whether you think the environment should be protected or not. It's not even about the ram's horn snail or the particular bats that we've talked about with the bat tunnel. Nobody disputes that the Arun Valley is a spectacular natural asset, and it's something that we should be protecting. And it's really good that we've got a public body that is concerned about rivers and pollution, and that is holding developers accountable and working with local authorities to try to make sure that those protections are in place. But in a way, that's not what Natural England are doing. It's almost like they've been given complete dictatorial power. And rather than using that to actually work with local authorities or work with developers towards some kind of common goal, it's turned into almost like the Spanish Inquisition or the Handmaid's Tale or something. Like, you almost imagine these people just turning up with like hooded robes and ceremonial maces and issuing doctrine to terrified bureaucrats like cowering under their desks. And like, none of this, like, it's toxic. Like, it fundamentally, like, the whole culture around this just seems completely toxic. There's no sense of like working towards a common goal or that we're trying to achieve the same things. It's just like, well, we have the power, so we're going to stamp on you until you fall into submission. And if there are massive consequences of that for the economy or for people's lives or for county councils, we just don't care. Like, it's not our problem. And it's just a disgraceful attitude for a public body to have. And honestly, I think one of the best things Labour could do for this situation, but for the environment generally, is tear up the whole thing, rebuild it into something that's much more aligned with that national interest of like, we want to progress, we want to develop, and we want to bring the environment with us and protect that along the way. Because ultimately, if you care about the environment, and I'm sorry to come back to this point yet again on this podcast, not addressing this stuff is the biggest risk. Because if Labour don't do it, Reform are going to come in. And do you think they're going to care about an organisation like Natural England? Do you think they're going to set it up in a way that's going to provide these protections? It is going to take one pen stroke for Farage or whoever he appoints to disband this organisation completely. And then you have none of those protections. And that's a really terrible position to end up in. And I think if we do end up in that position, Natural England themselves are going to bear a lot of the blame for it. End of rants.
I was going to say, I don't think I can top that. I think that's just the end of the segment.
And if you'd like to hear more impassioned rants against Natural England, then don't forget to like and subscribe.
I was going to say, I think you can hear previous Natural England coverage on episodes. Let me think. 1, 2, 3, 4. Basically, we slag them off every week. So if you've enjoyed that, you'll enjoy the rest of the show.
Exactly. And for every new follower or subscriber on your favorite podcast app, we will stamp on one ram's horn snail. No, we won't really. We love snails. I mean, I don't mind snails. I wouldn't invite them into the house, but it's a good thing that they exist. And yeah. Next thing, James. Let's move on.
So, Martin, last week it was the Conservative Party conference. Did you follow any of the coverage at all?
So, as you know, I personally would rather fire a nail gun into my own face than follow any kind of party politics. So, no. Can you remind me who the Conservatives are? Let's start there, maybe.
Yeah, the Conservatives, they were a big deal. We're all in this together. Long-term economic plan. Get Brexit done. Grant Shapps did something to do with making train announcements less annoying. It was a whole thing.
Yeah, funnily enough, a fun fact about me is that years ago I needed to come up with a password for something that was like a long phrase, and I actually put in long-term economic plan. Listeners can decide what that says about me. It was that point where every MP was saying it in literally every statement, and it was like, this is now so embedded in my brain that I literally can't think of any other combination of 4 words, and so I guess that's my password now.
There you go, listeners. Go and have a Google round, try and find Martin's accounts in various places and try your luck. Maybe you can get into his bank. Something like that. But Martin, the reason I wanted to talk about this is because the Tories are still pretty important, even though it's easy to forget they exist now with, like you were ranting about a moment ago, Reform are seen as the big right-wing party now. But the Tories, they're still the official opposition. And who knows, maybe in the next 4 years, there's a sort of non-zero chance they might turn things around because, remember, it was almost exactly 4 years ago this week. It was actually October the 6th, 2021, when Tim Shipman famously declared that Boris Johnson now squats like a giant toad across British politics, which has become like this notorious tweet.
I think what's remarkable about it is that absolutely nobody has picked him up on it. Like it's been 4 years and at no point has anybody on Twitter or Blue Sky gone, oh, that's Tim Shipman. I can't believe he said that silly thing. Let's all pick on him. It's just amazing the silence about it.
Well, the funny thing is, by the time he tweeted that at the time, the polls and everything had already turned. But my broader point is, it shows how the narrative can shift and how our assumptions can shift, because clearly that's what Tim Shipman thought at the time. And clearly everyone's assuming now that reform is inevitable. Well, who knows? Maybe the Tories could turn things around. Anyway, the reason I want to talk about this, Martin, is because at Tory party conference this speech, there was a really interesting speech by Claire Coutinho, the shadow energy secretary.
Okay. Go on. Why was it interesting? Let's humour this.
Okay, so first of all, and less relevant to abundance, I'm going to mention it anyway, though. Coutinho, she actually appeared to have taken my advice, as weird as it sounds. So before conference season, I wrote an article about how politicians should change up the conference speech format. It's old and tired, and I said they should give Apple-style keynotes like Steve Jobs used to do. And crucially, I think politicians should use a screen behind them and show us graphics and graphs and stuff, and not just stand behind a lectern and talk like politicians have done for the last 100 years. Anyway, I'll put a link to that on abundancepod.com so you can read how prophetic I am. But anyway, so what amazed me was seeing that Coutinho, she actually did this. She actually did a speech. It was about 23 minutes long. And it was still, a politician's speech. There were still digs and jokes and so on. But she peppered in some graphs. She tried to sort of explain things and talk about policy and stuff like that. And I just thought it was a sort of weirdly fascinating approach to take.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing behaviour from a politician at a party conference. I guess now, James, what you're trying to tell us is that you want to take credit for this, as you do for most things that are even tenuously linked to stuff that you've written. You tend to say, I wrote about Sunday trading and now suddenly it's the talk of the country. It must be because of my Substack that 7,000 people subscribe to. So I assume you think this is because of you as well?
Yeah, I feel like I'm in the Truman Show here and all of Westminster is reacting to my takes. But Martin, so that's not just that I wanted to talk about this for. It's because her speech was actually pretty interesting in the substance. And to my surprise, given that, I am a centre-left lefty type. I used to be more of a firebrand lefty type, but, now I'm 38. But I actually agreed with quite a bit of what she had to say.
Yeah, so when you're not claiming to have invented PowerPoint, James, you are increasingly known for your conservative views. So come on, show us some of these things that you've now adopted as your latest position.
Okay, so leaving aside that characterization, let's start with this clip, where it basically sounds as though Claire Coutinho, again, quite an important politician, she's been abundance pilled.
Today, there is not a single country on Earth which is high growth and low energy. That's because energy is not just part of the economy, it is the economy. It feeds into the costs of every business, every journey, every loaf of bread. That's why, right now, the cost of energy is one of the biggest problems that we have. It's a stealth tax that's making us all poorer, and it's killing our industry. The industries of the future need energy too, whether it's advanced manufacturing or AI. Whether it's a factory or a data center or a super lab, they will need cheap, reliable energy. And they'll go where they find it. It would be the first time in generations that we would no longer be at the forefront of a technological revolution and will be poorer because of it. Those businesses will be created, just not here in Britain. We won't have saved the planet. We'll have failed the next generation.
So, as you can tell from those two clips, there's still, lots of party political stuff in there. This is a conference speech after all, but I thought it was really striking because, and maybe this is just how low my expectations are, but like we say, we had a senior cabinet minister, someone who is regularly talked about as a future leader of the Conservative Party. She seems to actually get it. Like, she seems to get the problems of this country. And she specifically talks about, at one point, a persistent problem we've talked about on this podcast, which is air conditioning, and how just 5% of homes here have it. And compared to, nearly every home in America, she drew that comparison. And she laments at how the London plan, which we talked about on this show, basically bans air conditioning from being installed in London, because London takes this approach of arguing that we should build dual aspect flats so you get the natural wind sort of whistling through the windows, but it's not as good as air conditioning.
Yeah, that does sound quite Dickensian, the way that you've portrayed that, with the wind whistling through the windows and the frames rattling. We're massive fans of air conditioning on this show, of course. We talk about it a lot. I feel like we probably talk about it a bit less than we did 2 months ago. And I suspect it might be a few more months before we talk about it much again. But hey, maybe you can claim credit for this as well. Maybe she's one of our valued listeners.
It certainly sounds like she could be a listener, Martin. I guess we'll know for sure if she starts talking about, that road near you with all the potholes in that can't be fixed, and that'll be the tell. But anyway, I'll give you one more clip from the speech. Just another bit that I quite liked from the speech.
Increasing the cost of electricity is the worst possible climate policy too. If you want people to use electric cars, here's a revolutionary idea. Make electricity cheap. If you want people to use electric heating, make electricity cheap. If you want to build data centers to cut bills, to reduce poverty and drive growth, make electricity cheap.
So I think this is why I sort of agreed with more of what she said than I expected to, because, like I say, she understood a lot of the significant problems and understood a lot of the solutions, I think.
So, I agree. Nice vibes. Where's the policy, James? What's that?
Yeah, so the significant announcement over the last couple of weeks is that the Tories have said that if they somehow make it back to power, that's a big asterisk on that at the moment, but they would scrap the Climate Change Act.
Sounds pretty dramatic, James, and I suspect probably worrying to quite a lot of our listeners, but we do try and keep an open mind on things here, so let's steel man this. What's wrong with the Climate Change Act, do we think?
Yeah, so it's an interesting law. So it was passed in 2008, and it set up sort of most of the architecture for our current approach to achieving net zero. So it gave us the Climate Change Committee, which comes out every so often, and it sets sort of limitations on the amount of carbon that Britain is legally allowed to emit. And Coutinho's view is that basically this has driven a whole bunch of other government decisions, which in her view haven't worked out. So, for example, another thing we spoke about on the show before is the Contracts for Difference renewable energy scheme. So basically, this was a policy that started in the coalition government. The idea was that when you want to build out renewable infrastructure, you have the government say, well, we'll buy a fixed amount of energy at a fixed price. So that if you're investing in like building a wind farm or something, you get a guaranteed return on investment. It makes the wind farm seem like a good idea, where you're not at the mercy of the gas price going all over the place. But the problem is, she reckons, is that it's been a bad deal. So Britain's been paying over the odds, and she has some numbers in the speech, which I'm sure people could argue about. Real experts in this can argue about the exact limitations on where the limits are there. But the fundamental thing is she argues that all of this has pushed onto consumers, basically higher energy prices. And then there's a broader critique as well than just the Climate Change Act, but she really goes after Ed Miliband here, because she also doesn't like the carbon tax that's been imposed. That's imposed at the moment on fossil fuel producers. And she reckons that if we cut this tax, I think it's a 30% tax, 20% tax or something like that. If we got rid of this tax on fossil fuels, it would reduce energy bills for people in their homes by about 20%, or what she says is 165 quid a year for the, quote, average family. And then there's a whole bit of the speech as well, contrasting the claim that Labour at the last election, they kept saying that their net zero policy could cut bills by £300, but I think everyone at this point thinks that was probably a bit optimistic. So there was a sort of big critique in there, I think.
Yeah, so it's a challenging one. So I get that obviously we want energy and energy bills to be cheaper because that's good for the country, it's good for consumers, it's generally the more abundant and cheap electricity is and energy, the better it is for everybody. Obviously, if you removed carbon taxes, that would reduce energy bills by some amount. I'm not sure if I believe that it's 20%, because 160 quid a year is really not 20% of most people's energy bills, as far as I'm aware. And I also understand there are concerns about how far and how quickly can you build out renewables. We talked previously about Jeremy Corbyn's love of wind farms and his desire to put umpteen billions of pounds into plastering them all over the North Sea, and it's like, great, it's nice vibes, but also you've got supply chains, and are you actually able to build them cost effectively at that kind of scale? that quickly. And of course, if you go beyond a certain balance of renewables, then you start running into questions of how do you move that electricity around the country, and how do you make sure that it's backed with a more stable energy source like nuclear. But ultimately, if you're asking why energy bills in the UK are high, it's because of gas. It's because as a country, we are massively dependent on importing gas. And even if we weren't, even if we went and drilled the North Sea for it, it would still cost the same as the import cost unless we, subsidized it effectively. So if you're asking why energy bills are so high, it's because of volatility of gas prices. Sure, tax plays a small part, but the main answer is the wholesale gas price. And so you want to get rid of that. And also, climate change is still a thing. So what's your plan for that? And why isn't it nuclear and renewables, which are both clean and abundant and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, which are really, really volatile and expensive?
So this is why I'm a bit more skeptical about some of the things she had to say as well, because I care about the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that we're emitting as well. And I'll come back to nuclear in a moment, but there is a section of the speech I wanted to talk about, which she mentioned. She essentially makes the entirely accurate observation of how Britain is only a tiny proportion of carbon emissions. So I guess the argument is, even if we do all of this stuff, even if we have the carbon taxes and have higher bills to sort of facilitate a build out of net zero infrastructure, the argument is it will barely make a dent. And so in a sense, I think this is a bit like the technology argument that was made by the Tony Blair Institute. We spoke about them on one of our earlier shows, and the argument there is that we should really focus on green tech. If we can have British industry and British scientists working out how to make solar panels cheaper and batteries cheaper, then we can invent cheaper tech and then roll it out to the rest of the world, and that will get us to net zero quicker, because ultimately it's all about what India and China do. And Coutinho says similarly, she says, rather than force our people to be early adopters, I want us to be the early creators of the technology that we can export around the world, which again sounds like a really good idea, I think.
Yeah, if I'm honest, it all feels a little bit rhetorical in the sense that it's kind of pandering to the idea that net zero is the reason why your bills went up. And so let's not push this on the British public when it's going to be really expensive. But ultimately, if you're the creator of the technology, you're also going to be the early adopter of it, right? Because what's the biggest lever the government has to encourage these technologies? It's to make sure that they're being built and deployed in the UK and in the rest of the world. And so it sort of feels like a smart person kind of leaning into the fact that Reform and that vote are also actually quite pro-technology and pro-British manufacturing and so on. And it's building a more positive case, I guess, to sell to the public than what I would argue if I was being honest about it, which is that I don't actually care what our contribution is in global terms. I think it's kind of like dropping litter. It doesn't matter how much you drop. You have a moral responsibility to not litter, in the same way that you have a moral responsibility to not pollute or not leak excessive amounts of carbon into the environment. But I appreciate that is a bit old-fashioned and, dare I say, a bit conservative of me.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think we should be doing all the tech stuff as well. If we had some sort of a better policy for helping our scientists, maybe a looser visa regime to get some scientists over, something like that to try and do that, fantastic. But yeah, we do ultimately, I think if we want to be credible on climate, especially when persuading the rest of the world to do stuff and persuading India and China to do stuff that matters, we also need to be showing that we're doing our bit as well, even if it isn't impactful in and of itself. So I guess given this, then the challenge for the politicians is working out how to balance this need to demonstrate good behaviour with something that voters won't find repellent, I guess.
Yeah, and especially, to be fair, at a time when everything seems really crap and expensive and people just don't really feel like they've got the bandwidth or the capacity or the patience for dealing with problems that aren't, how am I going to pay my gas bill at the end of the month?
And I think the real tell that there is actual politics at play here, and it's not really just about reducing bills, came a bit later on in the speech. So Coutinho, she had a good bit on nuclear. She strongly supports it, which is great. She showed a graphic. Brilliant. She was showing a graphic, something politicians had never thought to do before. It worked really well because it was a map showing, the amount of energy that you could generate.
Map, James.
No.
A map. A politician with a map. Christ almighty. What are we going to have next?
I suppose it was actually more of a diagram. Now I say that. It was basically, she was making the point that the same amount of energy a nuclear power plant could generate is about the equivalent of having a solar farm the size of the Isle of Wight. Now, it's a big picture of the Isle of Wight, and it really made the point really starkly. But this was all in service of making a point clearly for the people in the room who aren't necessarily on board with net zero and doing stuff like climate change, because she says, on a small island like ours, when every inch of countryside is precious, that matters. So instead of carpeting the countryside and wind and solar farms, we will make it easier and cheaper to build dense, reliable, secure, clean nuclear energy. And I'm just thinking like, well, can't we have both? Why can't we just make it easier to build nuclear and solar panels and wind turbines?
Well, also, it sounds like she's found the perfect solution, which is, we're a small island. There's an even smaller island just underneath us, and we can carpet that in solar panels. The Isle of Wight. Finally, somebody has found a use for the Isle of Wight, other than for like people who live in Chichester to go on day trips in yachts there. Amazing. It's a win-win.
So I think we've solved it, Martin. So essentially, I just wanted to flag this up because, and again, maybe I've just set the bar really low here, but I thought it was really striking and sort of warm and old-fashioned to see a politician actually engaging with sort of policy substance on this sort of level. I mean, agree or disagree with her, it was like a reasonable political debate. I agree with some of the things she said. I disagree with some of the other things she said. And that was just nice to see, given the state of everything else in politics at the moment.
Yeah, and I think it's testament to the fact that not everything has to be dumbed down into sound bites. Like, I think you can actually give audiences a little bit of credit and talk to them like sensible adults. And I guess even more importantly, James, this is the next step on your journey to becoming a Tory, which you clearly are going to be by the time you're, 45?
I can't play golf, Martin. I don't think I'll ever be a Tory. But I also want to flag this because, I am a bit of an apologist for the current regime. I'm a little bit of a Starmerite. So this shows I can take the other side seriously. And let's be honest, the Tories could be in power. So what they say does matter. It obviously doesn't look like
and
at the
I
moment.
could have a film career, James. Nice.
And don't get me wrong, there was still, in this speech, there was still lots of normal, like, political Punch and Judy. But given the rest of the Conservative Party seems to be going to this weird, dark place at the moment, with other politicians in the party talking about white British people a lot, nudge, wink, wink, scary, ominous stuff. Like I say, it was sort of refreshing to see just a normal policy debate taking place and taking ideas seriously and painting a sort of more sort of optimistic vision of like an energy abundant future, which is nice and good to see.
Which is good, because if you're a rational voter in the UK, you should want there to be a non-crazy centre-right party holding Labour to account and not just kind of cede that ground to Nigel Farage and Reform. So it's nice to see the green shoots of recovery perhaps starting to appear, but I guess we'll see what the next few years, and particularly the next few months, when I'm sure we'll have another Conservative leader, brings. Now, maybe, like James, this has inspired some of our listeners to think about joining the Conservative Party in the near future. But if you're not quite ready to make that full transition yet, maybe you're just a little bit Tory curious, as we like to call it, there's a centrist organisation that you can sign up to, a kind of gateway drug, if you like, and that's this podcast, James. What should we ask our readers, our listeners? Sorry, they're not reading, unless something's gone very wrong. What should we ask them to do?
Martin, I'm not entirely sure I'm on board with this characterization, but nevertheless, anyone who's enjoying this content, make sure you're subscribed. Go to your podcast app, tell your friends, go on to WhatsApp now, send them a link to the pod and say, hey, you'll probably like this. It's like nerdy policy and politics chat. You're into that. So yeah, go and do that and give us 5 stars as well. Feed our egos. So, Martin, before we get on with this week's guest, let's do a very quick bit of housekeeping. And it's a bit of an awkward one for me because we both write Substack newsletters. And this week, I have not published anything. I have completely failed. And,
no.
I've got a very unsympathetic problem in that I've got these 2 pieces. They're both about 2,000 words or so each. They're in draft. I've been through them about 50 times. And I've, when you write something, you think you're about there, you're about 85% of the way there. And you just realize, oh, I hate this. Have you ever done that, or is that just...
That never happens to me. Everything I write is perfect on the first draft, and I press submit, press publish, and then I just go and have a nice dreamless sleep.
I've never been so jealous of your perfect life. So I've been struggling this week, but I will try my desperate best to get a couple of things out in this coming week. Martin, have you written anything this week?
I'm in the process of writing something, James, that'll probably be out Tuesday or Wednesday, and it is about Villain of the pod, Natural England. So good one for pod purists.
Cool. We'll put links to both of our newsletters, and mine will have something in it, I promise, on abundancepod.com. Now, finally, let's get to this week's guest. It's a good one this week. It's Praful Nargund, the CEO and founder of the Good Growth Foundation, which is a really interesting think tank, puts out loads of really interesting stuff. And I had a chat with him a couple of weeks ago about both some ideas for delivering housing more quickly, very on brand, and also how we can get Eurostar back into Kent, something we've also talked about on this show. So yeah, if you're into trains and housing, keep listening. And here's our chat. So I'm delighted to be joined now by Praful Nargund, the founder and director of the Good Growth Foundation. The inciting event for us inviting you on the show was a fascinating report you put out last month talking about some rapid reforms that could be done to the planning laws to try and get things built quicker, which is music to our ears. So I was just wondering, could you give us a flavour of the sort of things that you're proposing? How can we speed up planning even more?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and hopefully I'll have a bit of fun. So rapid reforms is very much, it's a classic GGF piece of work, if I had to describe anything that we ever do, in that we think these are the kinds of planning reforms that would actually be quite popular. They're very geared towards where housing need is the most, so you would hopefully have an impact on affordability. I think they make a lot of economic sense. That's something that's very important to us too. And they're probably quite good for the public finances and for OBR scoring too. We try to tick that box off as well. So, we like to think that policy proposals we put forward are smart, just, and popular. Those are the three things that we're always looking for. And in essence, what we did with that paper was we didn't reinvent the wheel at all. All of these suggestions are sort of out there in the world at large. And what we wanted to do was bring them all together. We put 4 proposals forward, all of which are either already on the books, but just need to be activated, or one which could be done via the upcoming planning and infrastructure bill, depending on how the government wants to consider the local planning committee bits. And we think if you adopt these 4, and I'm happy to talk you through the 4 things we're talking about, you get a much more strategic system that's primed towards growth, but you also get a system that is very, much more geared towards being rules-based, which we think is very, very important if you're actually going to get stuff built in this country. So the 4 things we talked about were to essentially take many more applications out of sort of the democratic punch and judy that takes place on local planning committees and give more direction for where local planning officers could just make decisions through those 3 areas that we talked about. We wanted far more extensive usage of the NDMPs that I think they're from the Levelling Up Act. You'll probably know about these, the National Development Management Plans, of which the brownfield passports is a version of them. We talked about, as others have, much more extensive NDPs that sort of, promote things like building around train stations, as an example. And we think those 2 first things are the most important. We think together, if you did that reform on what planning officers would just decide rather than having that kind of additional democratic layer, and you had much more extensive NDMPs, well, together you get a much more rules-based system where if somebody puts forward an application that fits the kind of growthy criteria that we think is really important, it can get built, right? And that's the real thing. And we thought that would probably make the biggest difference out of the 4 things we were proposing. And we thought that'd make the system much more like Japan's, not anywhere near as extreme as Japan, which is very zonal, as you know, but we sort of took a guesstimate on where we thought that would sit, and we thought that could get us an extra 58,000 houses a year or something like that. And then we had 2 more proposals, one which was about lifting the cap on NSIP, so nationally significant infrastructure projects, so it's a 500 home cap. Ministerial guidance could be used to change that so that you could have many more homes built on these big projects that the government is pouring money into. And then the little one at the end, enabling street votes, which I'm sure you've talked about before.
These ideas, they all sound great to my ears, but I guess I think over the course of doing this podcast and just living in Britain and talking to my co-host Martin, I think I self-radicalized into being a complete ultra on this. So how do you think this stuff would go down in terms of the delegated planning decisions, Pals, for instance? Basically, as I understand it, you're essentially cranking the threshold much further because at the moment, as I understand it, you submit a planning application. If you just want, a roof extension or something, the planning officer can sign that off. If something more controversial, it goes to the councillors. And you're saying, well, put even more in the hands of the bureaucrats. Do you, that sounds great to me. I'm a big fan of the bureaucrats. But will people go for this, do you think? Yeah.
What's the policy? I mean, this is a thing we think about a lot. So one of the things about the Good Growth Foundation is we don't just think about growthy policies, we think about how does it play out politically in particular. So what does Joe Public and Jane Public think about something like this? And it's worth talking about another report which we wrote, which you may or may not have heard of, Mind the Growth Gap, where we explored what the public thinks and feels about growth as a concept, what kind of growth they want to see. And the top line is they're actually pretty skeptical that growth benefits them anymore. Not that they've seen much growth in the last few years, but in particular on housing, there is a real struggle at large to connect housing as a growth lever, right? This is a problem that we've seen consistently in focus grouping and in polling, that people kind of go, well, we understand why building more houses might be good for a developer, but if I'm not going to live in that house, what difference does it make to my life or my housing costs or whatever? And so what we tried to do with the combination of rapid reforms is, for example, what might we say should be going to planning officers? Well, things that are in the local plan, or mid-tier developments, or medium sites, for example, where it's 10 to 50 additional homes. All of these things are about densification. They're going to be more favorable in areas where there is more housing demand. So more bang for your buck, you're more likely to have an effect on house prices in particular, right? So we think this is quite important, that if you are keen to see this type of agenda move forward, it's not enough to win the wonky argument. You've got to build a political consensus around it. And there is some, but actually it's quite disconnected from what voters are thinking about. And so it's really important that it is geared towards what is potentially going to have an impact on housing affordability and where the demand is the greatest. And actually, the proposal I get most excited about is the NSIP's proposal, the Nationally Significant Infrastructure Project, because we only modeled 2 NSIPs, right? When we were coming up with our numbers, right? We looked at the East-West Rail and we looked at the Transpennine route upgrade. We looked at those 2 and we modeled how many additional houses you might get. But there are way more projects than that. And, and this government in particular is pouring money into infrastructure. And I think there's a kind of, if you step back for a second, if we sort of have a helicopter view of all of this, there are some people that say, it's impossible to do anything in this country. Government is like treacle. We can't make things happen. Well, here you go. Here are 4 things that you can make happen, 3 of which are already on the books. It is possible to get this moving within a few years in a way that will actually impact people's lives ASAP. So, that I think is the bigger point we wanted to make. Delivery can be done even in these circumstances.
So just so I fully understand, the NSIP proposal, this is the lifting, you want to lift the 500 home cap on housing consent. So when a mega project, I guess, is determined to be a nationally significant thing, you can only say, I'm going to build up to 500 houses with it as a sort of part of the consent. Exactly. And you want to lift that. How big do you think that could go? And could we get to a situation where, I was going to say Angela Rayner, but I guess it's Steve Reed now. Can he be there just machine gunning NSIP decisions onto different parts of the country? Because that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I would use the term machine gun. Hopefully everyone is very happy. But I definitely think that's a huge opportunity for them. And actually, the fact that that has now changed, we are going again and saying, look, we did talk to MHCLG in the run-up to publishing rapid reforms. And we were very glad to see Matt Pennycook pointing out that many of the ideas that we've come up with were interesting and good. And so, we want Steve Reed to be thinking about them as well. But yeah, I mean, look, we looked at, as I said, just those 2 railways, and we estimated that you could get, I think on East-West, it was something like between 13,000 and 22,000 new homes on that route. Transpennine, we had even more, 40 to nearly 70,000 additional new homes. And there is sort of precedent for this, right? Because think about Old Oak Common, where there's been a huge number of homes built. There's something like, 22,000 additional homes there. Elizabeth Line, obviously, loads. If you live in London like I do, we've seen loads of homes sort of spring up around the Elizabeth Line as well. So we know there's substance behind this principle. And actually, this is generally something we are often pressing government to think about, that actually they are already pouring lots of money into lots of big things. How do they maximize that return? How do they get as much as possible from it? Well, this is an example of how you could do it by sort of combining the infrastructure with the housing as well.
And this wouldn't require a law. This is literally something the government can decide to do tomorrow.
We think this is just ministerial guidance that it can just be done without the need for new legislation, which is, as I said, the theme of all of these reforms that we put forward. Because, look, we hear noise about a new planning and infrastructure bill. Maybe there'll be another one after this one. Great, no problem. But the country is crying out for change, right? I mean, on a personal level, I mean, I care about growth for lots of reasons. I care about growth because I think it's a bit of a moral mission, actually. I've sort of been intellectually influenced by, I don't know if you've ever read it, there was a book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth by Benjamin M. Friedman. Not Milton Friedman, Benjamin Friedman. The M stands for moral. And it's all about how actually periods of broad-based economic growth are eras where you have great progressive leaps forward. And I believe it because I experienced it, right? My parents came to this country from India to work in the NHS with very little. And we obviously, our standard of living, our life has been transformed by being in this country. And I ended up with my mum being entrepreneurs and building a business from scratch that became a large business trying to make a difference in IVF. And so I sort of have drunk the Kool-Aid on this. I really, really believe all of this stuff. And I think I think part of the challenge that we see with populism, which I do see as a challenge to this agenda, by the way, because, populism often results in very economically illiterate things happening, right? Think about Brexit, for example. I know I'm making a big assertion there, but forgive me. That's what the GGF position is. And I think it is not disconnected from stagnant growth. I think it is not disconnected from the fact that people aren't seeing things changing and their lives being changed. So stuff on the books, make it happen.
I couldn't agree with you. I think that's a lot of the foundational ideas of our podcast, certainly in terms of we look at the world and think, we need people to be getting richer so they don't vote for the vote for the bad people. But I really want to get on to another topic, and this is something else we've published on recently. And I'll be honest, this is the real me. I know this is what people are tuning in for because it's because the demographics of our audience. I want to ask you about trains. So the Good Growth Foundation, you published another report recently all about bringing back Eurostar services or cross-channel services to Ashford in Kent. So just a little backstory for everyone listening, if they're not familiar. There used to be international trains from Ashford and Ebbsfleet, as well as St Pancras. Then the pandemic happened and Eurostar says it's no longer profitable for us to do this. So they stopped services. And every year since, they've been asked, you can restart them again? And they've gone, oh, not sure. And I think they've said like 2026 at the earliest. And that's basically a way of saying no, I think. So you think it should be brought back, and you've made the case. So what is the case for bringing back these services?
And I will make the case, but before I do, I have to apologise to you because we didn't consider Ebbsfleet, which I know is very close to your heart. So forgive us for only looking at Ashford. But I must say, I think many of the arguments we make about Ashford probably could be made on a bigger scale on reopening the services in Ebbsfleet too. Look, it is sort of emblematic of where the British economy has got to. That you've got this ghost terminal in the southeast that I think spent something like over 80 million quid in getting up and running and building. And it's just sitting there. As part of this work, I actually visited it. Have you ever been there since it's been closed?
I've not. No, I've heard there's an exciting designer clothes outlet down there now. That's all I've heard.
The train station manager very kindly let me and a colleague, along with some film crews and journalists and other things, into the abandoned terminal, into the part of it that used to be Eurostar. And it is like a time warp. It's like they closed it down and they left everything like it was. It's like a zombie movie. And then it's just left there. It's just left there in aspect. It's very strange. You've got all the Disney stuff there. You've got, they obviously had because it was Eurostar, they had like a champagne part of it as well. And they've got the champagne bottles lying around. Coffee only costs £2.50 because this is pre-pandemic. So, it's all sort of mid-pandemic. So, it's all very strange. Yeah, look, and it's sitting there. And when you're there, you do feel what on earth is going on here. And what we explored was we looked at previous passenger numbers, and we did look at when it was at the peak in the 90s as well as more recent times. We looked at the tourist spend that people spend in that region and, came up with some ideas of what kind of impact it could have if people were coming back and if the services did return and people were visiting again and spending money locally, and then calculate an impact, a GVA impact. We were talking about up to 2.7 billion over 5 years of impact on the local economy. And of course, I should say that is without, for example, thinking about trade or thinking about how businesses might change their behavior. It was a relatively straightforward way that we looked at it. But I think one of the things that has been shown, Elizabeth Line is a good example, but there have been other railways reopened and they have far exceeded the demand that was forecast. And that's one of the things that I think we need to get out of as a country, this kind of spreadsheet mentality when it comes to growth, right? Growth is a gamble on the future. going for growth, saying is, we believe we can go more and do more and back people to build businesses and we'll invest in the infrastructure to make it happen. You have to have that ambition that things can go further than maybe what you might think. And I think that was at the heart of Ashford International, because it is at the center of a region often thought about as very wealthy, but actually there are many pockets of deprivation on the coast. But in Kent in particular, and parts of East Sussex, all roads or all trains lead back to Ashford, which means that if you do fix this, if you do reopen it, it can have this massive effect on the entire region. So yeah, that was our thinking behind Ashford.
Fantastic. I think the case is undoubtedly compelling. They should have done this yesterday. But what levers does the government have in this case? Yeah. Because I guess this was a business decision by Eurostar originally. They said it's not making money for us. So does the government have a lever? Is it just a case of them offering some sort of subsidy and saying, well, we'll pay for it then?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of things. I mean, obviously, the Office for Rail and Road is very important in all of this. And they're obviously deciding about whether or not, they may have decided by the time this goes out, but they're deciding whether or not other operators are going to be allowed on the line. And I won't mention names, but my understanding is there are certain operators that are keen to reopen services at Ashford. And so clearly there is a spectrum of how hard they might go. They might make it more of a requirement or favor those operators that might open. I should step back for a second. Do you know about the depot issue?
Yeah, but just for the audience's sake, I guess this is there's a bit of capacity there, and then the government has to decide who gets to use it out of all of these upstart operators, and there's a big fight at the moment going on over it.
Exactly, and that is the big bottleneck. Can other operators come on? And that decision should be coming soon if it hasn't already come out by the time this goes out. So that's quite a critical step, and I'm hoping that they will allow others on, and that will allow others to take up the mantle, because Eurostar has been pretty firm that they don't want to reopen services. And then I think there is a challenge about the border infrastructure as well. I think that you do have to modernize the infrastructure. You do, obviously, the EU in particular is changing the requirements around going in and out of the EU. So that all has to be upgraded. The government has already invested money in other ports and other locations where this takes place to get it up and ready. And so we estimated about 3.5 million of capital expenditure. And then we made an estimate on ongoing costs that was sort of 1.5 million-ish. Now, I will say that doesn't include costs that the operators might incur themselves, but that's for a business model for them to put forward. But look, I do think that in the grand scheme of things, this is not a lot of money for the government to support subsidizing the reopening of the station. So we're pushing very hard.
We could crowdfund this.
Should we try? You try off the back of this. James and Praful's crowdfund. We can have a go. I don't mind.
Well, let's give it a go. So before we go, because I want to let you get back to more important things than talking to me, I do want to ask you more broadly. So the Good Growth Foundation, you're the founder. You came up with its central premise. You're putting out all this good stuff. But what actually is good growth? Because we talk about growth a lot on this podcast. Yeah. And I think a lot of the time we're very much of the mind of we just want the line to go up, because we look at all the graphs of British growth being stagnant, thinking we want stuff to happen in this country. So what is good growth and what is bad growth?
That is a great, when we first started this, and that was the first question everybody used to ask me, who is the Bad Growth Foundation? Can't we have any growth, please? I mean, I get it. I do get it. And any growth would be nice, to be honest. But I think it comes back to what I spoke about earlier about this kind of the moral mission of growth. For us, we're very open about this, that we have progressive politics. We're not aligned with a political party, though obviously I am obviously associated personally with the Labour Party. I'm a former Labour candidate at the general election. But the idea that we want to tie growth to progressive outcomes, that's where we start. And I think part of the challenge around good growth is that with that starting point, people have then tried to make it all things to all people. And that means that it's very hard to actually do anything, because you can't navigate the trade-offs, right? Because you can't do all things all the time, and you have to make some compromises if you want growth to happen. I think what we really care about is going back to this idea of, will a broad base of people benefit from growth? And that's why we started off with, trying to understand what the public actually want from growth. And we got very clearly this sense that actually they felt like the economy didn't work for them anymore. That there was a time 20, 30 years ago where they felt if the economy grew overall, it would benefit their lives. But actually people feel that less and less today. And I have to say, as a former entrepreneur, That was quite challenging because, I grew up under the last Labour government. Aspiration was at the heart of that government. My parents believed that. I believed that. We ran a business that was trying to use innovation to tackle the cost of fertility care. It had a social mission, but we believed aspiration is a good thing. And then I'm doing this work now and I'm talking to the general public. And when nigh on 70% of people will pick basic financial security over aspiration, you've got a big, big problem. So, I think it's really important that on this real mission for growth that everybody that we're talking to does also agree with, it's really important that we make sure it's connected to people's lives so we can maintain that consensus around it. So it can be there, not just for one parliament, but so that also we can get the kind of moral outcomes that I really care about and my team really care about as well. So does that give you a flavor of the way we think about it? And it has a big impact, I should say, on the way we work. So unlike many other think tanks, so we have in-house polling. So we're able to run our own polls. We don't have to go externally to do that. We have our own in-house focus grouping alongside policy development and economic analysis. So we'll often go out and talk to the public and understand the mood and where the argument is at when we're also doing policy work and trying to understand what the right thing is for growth too.
Fantastic. It's all really good stuff. So we're going to put links to all of your reports we've mentioned and everything on abundancepod.com. But for now, Praful Nargund, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So Martin, that's just about it for this week's show. How do you think it's gone?
Not bad. And I think we've only got about 10 before Christmas, James. So isn't that a terrifying thought?
Yeah, we'll need to start planning a Christmas special, Martin. So if any think tanks out there are thinking of publishing any Christmas-themed papers, then do let us know. But for now, I think we'll leave it there. So yeah, our Substacks are abundancepod.com. Go back to our archive, have a listen to previous shows. But other than that, we'll talk to you next week, I guess.
See you next week. James there, clinging onto the left, much like he's clinging onto his hair. No, that's you bastard.